Hi, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Bacon to Pie Magic. I'm joined by Lucy
Hi.
and Jam and Jude today.
Hello, I'm Jude.
And today we're going to be talking about some of the god cycles. Jude, you want to explain to that?
I pitched the idea for this episode, and what I wanted to talk about for it was the different cycles of gods that appear once every couple of years in Magic. Usually on a different plane each time, although we've seen some returns to them. And I thought these would be an interesting subject to talk about because they embody one of my favorite things in Magic, which is mechanics as flavor, or flavor as mechanics. Either of those are good stuff. But essentially, most cycles of gods have some kind of resiliency mechanic, whether that be indestructible or returning to your hand on death, stuff like that, to signify their immortality. And most cycles of gods also have some kind of mechanic that signifies these are beings of worship and you need to kind of put something into them to get something out of them. We'll talk about examples of this one shortly because it's a little bit more complicated. But I just thought that, these are big, splashy cycles with interesting mechanics on them, and they would be fun to talk about. So that's what we're going to do.
All right. And the first cycle we're going to talk about is
The
from
OGs.
the plane of Theros, correct?
Yep, Theros.
And what is their mechanics? What makes them gods?
All of the Theros gods are enchantment creatures, first of all, fitting in with Theros' enchantment theme. They are all indestructible, and they all rely on devotion. So you can see for the monocolored gods, you need a devotion of 5 or more, and then for the two color gods, you need a devotion of 7 or more. And in both cases, once you meet that requirement, they turn into creatures. Or, I guess, more accurate to the card is they are not creatures until you meet this requirement. And if you're wondering what devotion is, it's basically just counting the symbols in the mana costs of permanents that you have on the battlefield, and each one of a specific color contributes to that color. So not lands because they don't have mana costs, but your creatures, your artifacts, your enchantments, the gods contribute towards themselves as well. So yeah.
Uh,
The little
Ju-
pips.
What did you
Yeah.
rate them, Jude?
I gave them a B. I like the Theros gods all right. I think indestructible and devotion are very serviceable mechanics for signifying their like grand stature, and this was the first like swing at Magic designing at least a full cycle of gods. There had been gods that had showed up on cards before, but they were usually one-offs, or I think always one-offs. And I think,
Corona, the false god, is the only
yeah,
god from before this, and Corona is flavorfully nonsense.
yeah, she was the one I was thinking of, but I thought there might be others as well. Also, characters that might theoretically be gods, but Yawgmoth, but that came a while after this. Anyways, Theros gods are a B for me. I think they're all right. I just think that whether or not you like them is kind of going to come down to the specific mechanics of each individual card, because that's where a lot of the flavor of like the gods as characters comes from for this cycle. It's specifically like, what does their effect do? How does it work when they're a creature versus not a creature? Stuff like that. I don't think they're bad by any means, but I don't think they're the most interesting interpretation either.
I
Jam, what did you go?
I gave them an A. This was their first time giving them a mechanic, giving gods like ways to symbolize their godliness and their resilience and the fact that you need to worship them. I think is almost basically perfect because devotion is really it makes sense. Like you have, it's like amazing keyword right there. And you have to meet a requirement in order for them to be more effective. And I mean, indestructible in modern magic has gotten less good, but it's still a pretty decent keyword for like preventing removal and blinking removal.
Yeah.
And Lucy, what did you rate them?
This is where I'm putting my 1S tier because I think they got these right the first time. So Devotion actually started off as the mechanic Chroma from, I want to say it was Shadowmoor or Eventide. It was one of the 4 sets of the original
somewhere.
Lorwyn block. And so what they realized at the time was that Chroma, people really liked Chroma, but it was kind of funky back then. And so they knew they wanted to come back to it eventually. They just didn't know how. And the way they've reconfigured Chroma to be devotion, I think is probably the best way you can convey the concept of worship giving power. I think Flavorfully, when they've designed gods like this, even when they've brought back, like as example in this, like Clothis, god of destiny, is you have something where they mechanically do a thing that makes perfect sense in line with their colors and in line with their flavor. The idea that they can only truly manifest a physical form when given enough worship and devotion makes complete sense to me. I think that the Theros gods overall are flavor home runs. Mechanically, they've been strong, not across the board, but pretty handily. I mean, the original 5-color cycle have all seen play somewhere. The secondary versions of the 5-color cycle that we got in Theros Beyond Death all had their little moments. We've had many multicolor gods see play across, whether it's Commander, Standard, Modern. I mean, Keranos was a sideboard card in Splinter Twin for years. These are design S tiers, flavor S tiers, mechanical S tiers. I don't think they've matched them since, and I think we're just starting off with the best. So.
I almost agree. I may have a slight bias, though, as we'll find out later in the episode.
I'm a little more mixed on them. I think that like some of the Theros gods can at times risk being like 5-mana do nothing enchantments. Keranos is a good example of this. Only if you can't like turn them on before they hit the battlefield, because obviously you feel pretty good about dropping a 5-mana 6/5 indestructible with upside. But I don't know. I find
that
hit or miss.
Keranos was played basically to be an enchantment.
Well, yeah,
becoming a 6/5 eventually was an upside, but
yeah,
Keranos was played for that ability.
Sometimes I don't even want to turn on.
No, yeah. There's that old Rhystic Study video about keeping an Ashnod's altar around so that you can fiddle with devotion when a board wipe goes off, mainly.
I want to worship you, but not that hard. Just a little worship as a treat.
Human sacrifice is a valid form of worship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for Erebos.
All right.
Yeah.
Next one was Amonkhet, and we had some Amonkhet gods, dude.
Yeah, okay, so this is where I stuck my S. I really like the Amonkhet gods. They don't have the devotion mechanic, but they share indestructible. However, the way that the worship of them is expressed is that each of them cannot attack or block unless you meet some kind of requirement that is specific to the god. And that last part is what I think is interesting about it, because it makes them feel a little bit more personal, kind of like you're choosing one specifically that you are like investing your faith in, and you are sort of like following the plan or doctrine of that specific god. So like Hazoret wants you to empty your hand as fast as possible. Ronus wants you to have other big creatures. Bontu wants things to die. It helps that I think these guys are a little more like consistently overstated for their mana costs, and a lot like the Theros gods, they have activating abilities or triggered abilities, I think maybe in one case, that will give them some use in case you haven't yet met the requirement. And I don't know, I just think these guys are really cool. I think Amonkhet is a really cool plane, especially like post Aether Drift. I think a lot of the world building that they have done for it makes me really excited for a return to Amonkhet. And most of these guys are dead, but Hazoret's still kicking around, so I'll be excited to see her.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I gave them an A tier. They are really good. I especially like the fact that a lot of these ones have like a keyword that like also helps signify their flavor. And also Hazaret is a funny card because there was a Worlds tournament where there was
Oh,
some
God.
kerflunky there. Just say.
Yeah. So for those who don't know the story, there was a player whose name escapes me right now who was basically a combat step away from winning on the world's biggest stage. And they drew their card and went to combat because they were just excited to end the game. Well, unfortunately, they had put themselves in a position where they didn't have one or fewer cards in hand just by drawing for the turn, and they very easily could have just played out a card or discarded a card with Hazaret to do this. But because they went to combat, they reached the point where it had already been decided whether Hazaret could attack or block this turn.
Yeah.
And now Hazaret could no longer swing because they rushed to combat in their excitement and also just nerves, because again, they're at an incredibly high competitive level. And this was heartbreaking to watch. Commentary. I think everybody watching was like, "Oh, that's the nerves are clearly causing issues here, and that's unfortunate."
The gods are demanding.
Yeah.
And Lucy, what did you rate them?
Amusingly, so I gave them an A, and one of my biggest complaints with these gods, and by biggest I mean really my only main complaint, is that I think they're actually just too easy to turn on. And that's not always the case. Like, I think Kefnet's basically impossible to turn on in any scenario where you actually want to play him. Kefnet basically has the Kamigawa problem of don't play cards from your hand and still expect to win the game. But like, Bontu just requires that a creature died under your control this turn. That's you can very easily do that. Controlling another creature of power 4 or greater, we've seen how easy that is to do in green. Having one or fewer cards in your hand, that is usually where you want to be in a really aggressive red deck once you're playing 4-mana cards anyway. And so I think I just lost a little bit of the level of like commitment you had to make to your god with the way they designed these. Is you could just you could splash them in if you wanted to, but realistically, the tasks you had to complete for the actual good cards in this cycle were just, I think, too minimal. Also, if I remember correctly, I believe only Hazaret and maybe Ronas saw any significant play. Hazaret obviously saw a ton of play. Hazaret was incredible. This mechanic of one or fewer cards, lovingly referred to as Heckbent, was just reliably good. As it turns out, that's what Mono Red wants to do anyway. But flavorfully, I do like the Amonkhet gods. I think this is a really cool design space, and I like that they're going back to it, and that we get to see how the plane and the flavor can evolve as the story moves forward. But I only give them an A because I do just think it's kind of like, oh, well, how do we make our god happy? We do one very tiny thing, where in Theros it was like, okay, well, we need a bunch of people to actually care about our god to make them a god.
All right.
I think each fits the respective world.
Yeah.
Next mechanic, next cycle, was the bug gods. Jude?
The Buggy Wuggies.
Yeah, so I gave these fellas a B. I don't actually know if they're fellas. I gave these weird bugs a B. I think these are all right. The flavor with them, if I'm remembering correctly, is that these were the original deities of Amonkhet before Bolas came along and kind of reshaped the plane in his image. And he kept these 3 around as like his personal kind of horsemen of the apocalypse. There have been mentions, I think, in one of the Aetherdrift commander decks of there being like a couple more of these. So maybe in the future we'll see a complete cycle. But like, I know one of them is the Fly, but I don't remember what the other one is. I don't know. These guys are all right. Power level is kind of all over the place. Scorpion God is definitely the weakest. Locust God is pretty good. And then Scarab God is pretty, like, crazy. Especially in Limited. And no slouch in Standard, either.
And what's their mechanic that makes them godly?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Each of these have, when this god dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. They're just hard to kill, generally, which I think they're kind of supposed to be like zombified to an extent. So that makes sense for them. Also, I think it's funny that there's one for each of the Grixis color duos, and Bolus is the Grixis guy, so it works out. It's cute.
I gave them an A tier. I like how whenever you try to kill these little bugs, they fly or tunnel back to your hand is kind of like how I make sense of it. And it's like they're bugs. So it makes a lot of sense that when you're gonna try to kill them, they're gonna like try and tunnel back to your hand. I will also say that another part of these gods that I like is that if there's like an exile removal spell on the stack, you can sacrifice them if you have an effect on board that can sacrifice them and blink the removal, sort of blink the removal spell and get it back to your hand if it's like an exile removal spell. And Lucy, what did you rate them?
So I actually went the opposite direction from Jude's, where I went further down. So if these were insects and that was the flavor of it, maybe that would be cool. But as gods, I think the returning it to the owner's hand at the beginning of the end step kind of just makes them have like a really good zombie mechanic as opposed to a god mechanic. These cards just don't feel like gods to me. They feel like incredibly sticky, annoying creatures that kind of fall flat in flavor in a lot of ways. So originally, yes, they are corruptions of 3 Amonkhet gods that existed alongside the original 5 that were corrupted and repurposed for Bolus's purposes. All these cards in their own way can be very strong. I actually think the Scorpion God, while being the weakest, is the one where they're going to forget about it, and then they're going to print something that says like put a -1/-1 counter on all creatures based on some factor, and suddenly people are going to be paying $30 for Scorpion Gods for no good reason. Scarab God is probably just a printing mistake. This is one of the most oppressive limited cards to ever exist. It was very solid in standard. It's been solid in other places, so maybe there is some lack there. But in limited, if your opponent plays a Scarab God, just stop playing the game and go enjoy your life. Locust God is a commander card through and through. It's been reprinted, I think, 3 or 4 times in various commander decks because if you sneeze too hard around it, like many good Izzet commanders, it just combos. And it should be noted that it makes insects with haste, so it's very easy to just kind of do the Splinter Twin thing with it if you can just draw a bunch of cards. But flavorfully, they don't feel like gods to me. They just feel like sticky creatures. I think their designs are cool. I can see where they were going for them. I like the idea that the Locust God makes a bunch of bugs. But these are overall flavorfully just kind of a miss for me. Cool cards, they don't feel like gods to me.
Oh, darn. That's so sad. Alright, the next cycle was also Amonkhet, but these are corrupted zombie gods. Jude, take it away.
Yeah, so the God Eternals are the Lazotep plated zombified versions of 4 of the original Amonkhet gods. Hazaret got away; she survived, and so the cycle is filled out. Bless. The cycle is filled out with its red slot by Ilharg the Raised Boar, which is one of the Ravnican animal gods, similar to Ansrag from Murders at Karlov Manor. Ilharg is the only one of these I've actually played with, but I've played against most of them, and these are cool. I don't like them as much as the original Amonkhet gods. I think I gave them an A here. Yeah, I gave them an A. I don't like them as much as the original gods, since they don't really have a worship mechanic to them, which makes sense. I don't think anything is actively worshipping these at this point. But they are designed to all work well with their original incarnations, like, God Eternal Bontu sacrifices a bunch of stuff when he comes into the battlefield, and the original Bontu wants you to sacrifice stuff so that it can attack. As opposed to any kind of, like, indestructibility or other resilience like that, they get put into your library 3rd from the top, when they die, which I think is really cool, actually. I think it combines the like god and zombie mechanics together really well, and that you can take them down temporarily, but they're gonna kind of like reconstruct themselves over time, or something like that. In another context, like maybe with Ilharg, I could see it being something as like these are cyclical gods that reappear throughout certain points in history, or something like that. But yeah, I think it's fun design space. I like these guys. Shout outs to God Eternal Cafnet for getting the biggest glow up of any of them, I think.
Yeah.
I
You
gave
glow up to a functional card.
I gave them a B tier simply because unlike I like the insect gods when they go back to your hand. I think it's like makes it like more sticky than going into your library third from the top, which is why I bumped these down a letter grade from the insects. I just think third from the top is such like it sounds good in like almost theory, but then when you play with them, it's almost like, oh wow, I kind of don't even want to put them down that far. Except for maybe with the blue one, typically because blue is pretty good at drawing cards. What about you, Lucy? Would you rate them?
So amusingly, I'm about to defend the mechanic, but I gave them a C because they have basically the same issues that I have as with the bug gods. Of like, if you just said these were zombie titans, if you just said these were zombie giants, if you just gave them zombie cat, zombie bird, zombie gator, you could print these cards exactly the same. And so, judging them as god cycles, that's kind of where I was trying to put some weight. But I will say, it's the reason they go third from the top in the library instead of into your hand is almost like WotC learned lessons from designing the bug gods and then being way too good, and Scarab God being this unkillable monster. And so this actually presents an ability for your opponent to prepare for their arrival in a sense, where it's like, oh, I've dealt with. So one that's not pictured here is God Eternal Ronus. And God Eternal Ronus, for those who may not be familiar, it's a 5 mana. I believe it's like a 5/5 with Death Touch. But when it comes into play, it gives all your creatures +X, where X is the number of creatures you control. And so, God Eternal Ronus, if you were able to survive it and somehow pick it off, that was almost the worst case scenario by picking it off, because you knew in 3 more turns you were going to be hit with another overrun that came alongside a giant 5/5. So I think it gave more flexibility to play around them, and so in that sense, like, I almost wanted like to put these. It's more like a C plus, like B minus. But I kind of have the same issues that I did with the bug gods, and I'm being a little nitpicky on it. But when it comes to god cycles, that's really what I care the most about, is the flavor.
You know what, Lucy? You're right. Putting them into hand would be too strong, but also, you know what?
I get it.
You know what? For the bit.
Wow. Oh, have I persuaded? Oh, you're going the other way. Okay.
Unpersuaded.
Right. You're right.
Fair enough. I accept. Let me have the pessimism. I'll wield it like a blunt club.
I have changed my answer up to A tier because WotC is smart and learned from their lesson.
Aw. Yeah, I will say the ones of this cycle that have an enters effect, which I think is just Ronus and Bantu.
Correct.
Yeah, I think those have a little bit more play with them because, you get the enters effect again when they die. That's cool, but...
Yeah. The other ones, it's more of a stickiness mechanic. Also,
yeah.
I'm not even going to touch on Ilharg. Ilharg being in this cycle, like, it works because we needed a red god and it wasn't Hazret, and Ilharg's a cool card. But, like, if this mechanic makes sense based on them being, like, undying, zombified gods... then this idea that like Ilharg works on this same cycle of rebuilding is just kind of silly to me. But that is very much a nitpick.
Yeah,
they were just filling a hole in the cycle.
I think it's showing how the same like mechanic can represent 2 different things. Because I don't think Ilharg is supposed to be a zombie. It's just like a cyclical deity that shows up
Correct.
for big
Because
disasters.
all the old gods of Ravnica, as far as I'm aware, currently are basically, there's a reason the Gruul worship the old ways, is they are big beasties.
Yeah.
Like a mole of some kind.
Yeah. I think a lot of them are like dormant or something too. I don't think we'll ever see a
Yeah.
full cycle of them, but I don't know.
I think we'll see a decent amount of them over the years. As maybe this is a bit of a unfortunate angle on it, but I just think they're like, okay, we need more ways to do more things on Ravnica, and for some reason it's not good enough to just go back and do the guilds again, even though everybody loves it. And people like God, so we'll find ways to squeeze one more God in every Ravnica set.
All right. The next cycle was
Oh boy, this one.
it's Kaldheim gods.
Yeah,
Jude, take
so-
it away.
I gave the Kaldheim gods a C. The flavor that they're going for with these are, much like in Norse mythology, the gods of Kaldheim are not actually immortal. They're basically just really cool humans. Gods, I believe both on Kaldheim and in Norse myth, are essentially just a separate species from humans that, were around in the mythic past and did a bunch of cool stuff. And they have what's called the Elixir of Immortality, which I believe they get from the sap of the World Tree that makes them immortal.
The Cosmos Elixir, I believe.
Yeah, but pretty much unlike any of the other gods that we've seen up to this point, they don't have a resiliency mechanic, nor do they have a real worship mechanic. Some of them ask you to jump through hoops, but so do a lot of cards that aren't gods. What they do have going for them is that pretty much all of them have some kind of artifact or enchantment, some kind of relic or associated story on the back that ties into them that you can cast either to synergize with them or just because, I don't know, I think for 60 card play, it's if you already have one out and you're running 4 copies, you can cast the backside. But as far as I know, outside of that context, Commander, mostly they just, most of them just see play for the front side.
Well, most of them see play for a very specific side. Most of
Yeah,
the time.
Her grid, her front side is much better than the lantern on the back.
And I think the Ringheart crest is better than the front side.
Yeah, Kolvori is pretty middling. I like Kaldheim a lot as a plane. The gods are definitely one of the least interesting. They're interesting story-wise. I just don't think the cards are very interesting. So, yeah. C for them.
I gave them a D because I forgot they were gods until I was researching them for this podcast. And I mean, I know that in Norse mythology and these are tying back to Norse mythology, the gods aren't actually gods in the traditional sense. But they still have the elixir of immortality from Kaldheim, and I don't think it's really that aspect is really represented very well on the cards. I will say the only reason I didn't put these in F tier is because I think some of the backsides are actually pretty neat and pretty cool, and evoke the stories that people tell about them pretty well. And Lucy, what about you?
So I'm coming in as C tier, but I'll admit I'm kind of judging them by their lowest common denominator here. I'm largely in the same boat as Jude on the Kaldheim gods. I think there are actually some designs that are well done, and I think those usually come down to pairings where the backside is maybe a little more recognizable, and some of these are maybe better flavorfully than the average player will give them credit for, because some of them do tie into some relatively niche Norse myth. But something like I don't even remember his name. I think it's Torgolf, the Thor stand-in, where the other side is the lightning hammer that returns to you. Their Odin stand-in turns into a raven that can see the future through scrying. I think there are some that are A-tier designs, but overall, there's just too many of them, and a lot of them end up being middling. But I think C is a fair floor. They don't they're through design of having a relevant artifact, or in some other cases, enchantment or creature on the other side, is interesting, and it sometimes works, but it just doesn't work for most of them, I'd say. It just works in a few highlighted areas. In terms of like mechanics, like Jude already touched on, they usually see play for one side or the other in general. I believe the Odin stand-in saw a decent amount of play because the bird could come down on 2 and then return to your hand so that you could cast the god.
Yep.
In Commander, you have a Sika. MTG Arena Brawl players will, I'm sure, have at some point run into the Prismatic Bridge, and that's a Sika's whole purpose, is to be cast on the other side. If you ever cast a Sika on the front side, you have probably misclicked. So.
Yeah, I don't know. The most iconic. You go first, Jam.
I just forgot these were gods, and I thought they were humans.
Yeah. Ironically, I think one of the most iconic members of this cycle, at least to me, is Volti, which is funny because he's not actually a god. That's Tibalt impersonating a god. However, I do think it's really cool that he's like a 2-drop on the front side with a kind of useful upside, and then like a gigantic 8-mana planeswalker on the back. That's a neat way to give them a little bit.
The coolest
more
card of this cycle did something that none of the rest of them did, and also was so broken they had to change the way Cascade works.
Yeah.
and free casting. Yeah.
A lot of these are just kind of weirdly designed. Like the Lantern and Tergrid curve into each other, but you would never want to cast the Lantern because Tergrid is so stupid.
I mean, you would if you wanted to play. I get the idea of yes, there generally was a how do we mitigate putting too many copies of a legendary creature in your deck with these, and I can appreciate that as an answer from a design perspective. That doesn't show up in Commander, but as much as we get sets where half the cards are some random Commander nonsense, sometimes these were not explicitly designed for only Commander, and so I think that's a pretty nuanced solution. I'll give them that.
Don't get me wrong, I love MDFCs. I just don't think this cycle uses the features of MDFCs particularly well.
Also, you heard it here first. Best Norse god is Tibalt.
I agree. If these were all had planeswalkers on the back, I would have bumped them up.
I would not have. I would have given them F tier if these all had planeswalkers on the back. There's so many of them.
All right. The next cycle is a Commander Legends cycle.
This is Commander Legends Baldur's Gate.
Yeah, why don't you just take it, Lucy? Because I don't know the lore on these guys whatsoever.
All right, just run me through on these. So these are representations of the Dead 3, which if you have played Baldur's Gate 3, you will be familiar with them. If not, then hopefully D&D has done some justice to you eventually. But Bane, Baal, and Merkul are all representations of different gods of death. And so Bane is a little bit more of a devious manipulator who is going to just scheme you to death. Baal, quite literally the Lord of Murder. He just wants people to continue killing and killing in his name. He is basically the non-Warhammer version of Blood for the Blood God. And then Merkul is, think of it a little more in a necromantic sense. It's reusing the dead and repurposing the dead and commanding the dead. So that's where you get, for those who are familiar with the Merkul fight from Baldur's Gate 3, he summons a lot of necromites, I think it is, necromites, which are undead sages that he can then reconsume to heal himself if he gets low enough,
And I think their resiliency mechanic on their card is...
yes, the resiliency mechanic is if your life total is less than or equal to half your starting life total, then they have indestructible. So essentially, if you've been doing enough violence, they're happy.
All right, Jude, what did you give them?
I gave these guys a C, mostly just because I don't really know them or particularly care about them. They're cool. I think they're fun designs. I like that they're, very heavily leaning into black. That makes a lot of sense for three gods of death. The whole life loss mechanic is interesting as well, in case you want to pretend you're playing Death's Shadow in Commander. And I don't know. They're all right. I just don't really have strong opinions about them one way or another.
I also gave them a C for couldn't care. These are pretty average, and they're just mediocre, middle of the road.
Funny enough, I started at a C. I started at a low C, and then I slowly talked myself up into what would have been a very high B, and is settling in a B. Because the more I look at these cards, as a D&D nerd and all that is, I actually think they did a pretty dang good job representing the different flavors of death and dismay that these gods convey. I like that Bane forces your opponents to play games where the outcome for them is bad either way, because that is kind of Bane's whole thing. I like that Baal basically encourages other creatures to do more murder upon murder happening. I like that Merkel says, "Oh, you're dead. That's fine. You can still serve me. You can still have a purpose." I don't have any super strong feelings about these cards inherently. They're not going to be seen play ever outside of Commander. I've only ever seen people try to play Merkul. I think I might have seen maybe one Baal deck. But I gave them a little bit of a higher grade because once I kind of stepped back and said, all right, well, what are the complexities of these characters that they were trying to convey? I realized I was like, they actually did a really good job with getting these on a card. If I had to pick a favorite, weirdly enough, I think it actually is Baal. I find it very amusing that one creature dying results in you going, hey, you, go do more kill. Good job. Here's your counter. Here's your reward. Here's your treat. Now go do more murder.
I do.
Baal's Happy Meal toy.
I do like me some blood for my blood gods.
Yeah, I appreciate blood for the blood god. I strive for skulls for the skull throne. And Bane, well, I guess people are thirsting over your representative in Baldur's Gate 3 at least. So you have that.
All right, the last mechanic.
Yeah, so this is the most recent cycle of gods, and they are the old gods of Ixalan. I can't remember the exact LCI lore for them, but essentially, Ixalan has a succession of peoples that have been kind of formed a bunch of different societies that have risen and fallen. The current crop of folks up on the surface of Ixalan are the fifth people, and then I believe either the third or the fourth people. These are their gods essentially, or these are the names that they assigned. Or it might be the first people, honestly. I don't remember exactly, as I've already said. But the gods reincarnate along with the civilizations, essentially. But the five of them weren't seen during the original Ixalan because they were all underground, essentially, is all you need to know. And the resiliency and worship mechanic, which is kind of combined for these guys, is when they die, they return to the battlefield tapped and transformed as lands. And each of these lands will have a different method for transforming back to their front side, in addition to just being a land that you can tap for mana. So, for example, Temple of the Dead is the backside of Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, and that's a card that can make people discard back into the god if a player has one or fewer cards in hand. So, they work together in that sense. You are furthering Aklazot's goals and thus can return him to life, essentially. And I gave these cards an A. I really like Ixalan. I think these gods, while the individual members of the cycle can definitely vary a little bit in power level and overall splashiness, I think they're all at a pretty good place. And they're just cool. I like ancient Aztec myth. I like Ixalan. I like god cycles. O'Hare Pactopic is like a cool Quetzalcoatl snake with feathers. Yeah, no, these guys are sick. O'Hare Axonil has a dinosaur arm. Like, come on. Come on.
Man.
I gave these. I put my S on these. I will stick my S on these guys. I think turning into the land is like one of the. So like I really like the bug gods and the zombie gods quite a bit, and like their resiliency mechanic. I think it can be sometimes annoying in like certain formats, especially the ones that go right back to your hand. And everybody knows that the Scarab God was kind of a menace and limited. But I think that the fact that these go into your to a land that you can transform if you meet their devotion mechanic is pretty neat. Pretty neat. I also like the fact that you can sacrifice themselves to ramp. that's that's a joke. That's a joke. But yeah, I think these are actually pretty evocative of like Ixalan's god. I also like Ixalan as a plane, and a lot of these have like cool like dinosaur or like serpent features just because Ixalan is a plane with a lot of weird and wacky creature types. And Lucy, what did you rate them?
So I had them at a high B, low A. I'm kind of tempted to move them back up towards an A. I do like the fact that they flip over into places of worship for themselves while they like return in power to come back around. I do kind of wish they were a little more balanced in their return conditions. And when I say balanced, I mean like some of them are significantly more difficult than others. I really like the way that Ogier Pakpatik is handled, where you come in with time counters and you remove time counters from it by using it for just mana. And then when there's no time counters on it, you can just transform it back. And, so it's kind of like, yeah, this is a god that handles time nonsense. So they come back with time. But it's like the white one flips if you attack with 3 or more creatures. That's so easy. Like that's practically brain dead.
Especially because it triples the tokens you make on the front side.
Yeah. Whereas you can only flip Aclazotz if a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand. And that's surprisingly difficult to achieve. It requires building a deck very strongly around discard, which, as someone who really likes discard decks, is not always the easiest to do. But overall, I do like their designs. I am a big fan of like Mayan pantheons. So I would have loved to have seen more of this. I would love to see more of this in the future. I remember when they spoiled Aclazotz and the blue god, whose name I will try not to butcher again. I think they both got me really excited. I was excited to see a Quetzalcoatl god. See for those who may be familiar, probably through Smite, realistically, like Kukulkan is basically Ogier. You have oh god, why am I spacing on his name? Camazotz is the representative here with Alcazotz. You have a lot of these gods showing up. I would have loved to have seen my boy Chibalanque or X-Ball get some love here. I will also mention there is one god in this cycle that doesn't actually do this same trick. There is the blue-black god from Ixalan, who has a more traditional form of being active, where there is a condition, and once that condition's met, then they can attack and block. It doesn't really feel like a god, though. It feels kind of odd.
The thing with
it's the ancient one for those, sir. Yeah.
The thing about that is Aclazotz is not an original member of this like pantheon. Aclazotz was like, I think, just some guy from either the 3rd or the 4th people who is sort of like scammed his way into the position as like the black member of the cycle and cast out the original person serving in that role, or the original god, and that god became the ancient one or the forgotten one. And that's why on the backside, you can't see it on this slide, obviously, but the flavor text of all of the temples is Chimil gave the Oltec something, and the O'Hares are all basically teaching the people how to use it. Aclazotz Chamil gave the Oltec peace and death. Aclazotz ripped it away because Aclazotz is also the progenitor of vampirism on Ixalan.
Yep.
Right.
AKA those dirty, dirty vampiric colonizers. Who
friggin'
should all be
Spaniards.
destroyed.
I also
Friggin'
like
Spaniards.
how many
Conquistador
times people have
nonsense.
scammed their way into being gods.
Yeah, it happens. Like, I think the only plane with gods that it hasn't happened on is like arguably Amonkhet, but that whole plane is kind of a scam.
I mean,
I guess we can see where it goes. I'm trying to think of how you would achieve godhood in Amonkhet that could be scammable. Because like call time, like yeah, you can go steal like Cosmos Elixir, but like really, Tybalt didn't become a god. Tybalt just played the role of one. Like Alcazotz actually became a god, and Xenagos obviously, the pioneer of becoming a god through your own means and magic.
Bootstrapped, dude.
Ashiok made a god on Theros in the comics that we finally got a card for. I can't remember what set we finally got that card in. I think it was Modern Horizons 3.
It wasn't Flage, was it?
No. Oh, goodness. I'm going to...
Titans are different.
God.
But I think
I want to find it.
that's all we have for today, guys. Did you guys want to say anything else?
Deity cycles are cool, and this episode has inspired me to try and build Gruul Indestructible Tribal. I might give updates on how this goes in a future episode if people care.
I will say, do not deck build and drive at the same time. Lucy, you want to say anything else?
In the name of the god of slaughter, Mogus, just for this one episode, you can deck and drive.
Aww. How sweet.